My name is Zlatko Šabić. I'm coming from the Center of International Relations from the University of Ljubljana. Good afternoon. Our panel, I'm going to go straight to introducing the speakers in a way, hopefully that will also kind of bring an introduction to then our debate. On my left-hand side is Barbara Lippert, who is obviously well known. I'm really happy that we have her with us here, an expert on EU enlargement policy, and also the author of one book that I thought was pretty important and has in some way also contributed to the 1990s and then 2000 debate, The Pressure of Europeanization, from post-communist state administrations to normal players in the EU system, of relevance because simply the term Europeanization seemed a bit obsolete to some, but actually, as we can see now, and we've had the debate today, we see that actually this is anything but true. It is quite relevant. And as Peter Kratochvil has also mentioned, that in spite of all the challenges, there is still optimism in Europe, maybe due to indeed learning about good things and positive experience United Europe offers and can offer. Then Christian Lequen on the far right, if looking from your side. He's a professor of sciences and teaching also at several places in Italy, in Vienna, and also here in Prague. And very important, he's coming more from my field, from international relations. He's currently co-chief editor of European Review of International Studies, which is a kind of policy counterpart of theory-oriented European Journal of International Relations. Worth reiterating is that he was also awarded the Palatsky Social Sciences Medal by the Czech Academy of Sciences, and he just recently published a book called Ethnographie du Quai d'Orsay, which is the result of a 3-year research of fabric of French diplomacy and foreign policy. And again, for this discussion, this may well be a topical book for a topical moment in the history of Europe. Then Nicole Koenig, she's a senior researcher. Senior researcher, research fellow and deputy head of research at the Jacques Delors Institute. Her work experience includes affiliation in a very famous, influential think tanks such as Institute of International Affairs in Rome, and she also had a stint with DITEPSA, which is the largest and arguably the most influential network of think tanks in Europe. She's an expert on EU foreign security fields, and again, something that may also be very important for our discussion, risks and opportunities for Franco-German leadership in this field, so I'm really happy to have for us to have her here as well. And then last but not least, Pavel Šieboda, deputy head and acting leader of the institutional team of the European Political Strategy Center, and his past career, again, something I think very important for our discussion, is that he worked with the Polish government. He worked as director of the EU department there, and he also advised the president of Poland for 4 years. And something that I think is also important horizontally wise, he's a member of the Council of the European Council for Foreign Relations, and he's also columnist on foreign policy in Gazeta Wyborcza, which is the Poland's obviously largest daily newspaper. So, an announcement for everybody. You have heard that already at the beginning, the first session, but I would just like to repeat it, that you can also ask questions from the audience without raising your hands. Just use the internet, use the instructions, and the questions will appear on the board, and I'll simply have a look, and obviously the most interesting, the most important questions will also be put to the panel. Just one organizational thing: the dynamics of our discussion will be hopefully high. It's not a formatted discussion. It's going to be going with the flow. So I don't expect us to be friends. I expect us to be critical, and also obviously audience would be obviously also encouraged to ask critical questions. And something that I would very much encourage everyone is something which I would say is generally a problem in Europe, and that is that we tend to be very skillful and successful in identifying problems. but we are not very good at finding solutions or recommendations. So whoever asks the question, he or she might also want to add what his or her recommendation would be. That might actually help in the end the organizers as well to put a paper together as a kind of an added value to this conference. So, Berlin still deciding the future of Europe. My answer, this is going to be my only contribution to the debate, is absolutely. To some extent also, unfortunately, for all sorts of reasons. It is, yes, there have been, obviously, this has not been an easy relationship between the two countries, but as we can see, and there are certain things where the relationship, good relationship and strong cooperation is important, defense, Eurozone, and there are challenges that require leadership. Some of them have been identified at the first panel as well. Brexit, which left a big hole in Euro politics. Historically, Britain pulling out from the continental Europe has never been good news. Then obviously Trump's entrance to the international political arena, unpredictable Putin. Within the membership, and we have also seen that at the earlier panel, we have not even internalized human rights for everyone equally. So leadership in Europe is needed. And when we try to conceptualize it, we need to start with arguably most powerful countries among the 27. Now, what sort of leadership? Well, this is something that is yet to be seen. Massimo D'Alema was opening some important topics directly relevant to the content of leadership. Our task is to open some more, not least because of the two locomotives, but also to basically try to narrow down the general discussion to some specific areas, which in our case would be obviously foreign policy, defense. Basically, the one thing that we have seen successfully, very happily, it's been emphasized several times, that France elections went pretty well. Now, obviously, Germany is next. And Jaap de Zwaan, TEPSA Secretary General, says that this is going to be obviously a very important election. But at the same time, he's also saying that when it comes to the Europe perspective, Europe future, CDU, CSU, and SDP, there's not really much of a difference because both parties are in favor. But still, I think it is very important to sort of get an idea, not a prediction, because we are not very good at predictions, obviously, when you look at the Hillary situation and then obviously Brexit. But still, scenarios, how do we go from the French election? So I would like to invite Barbara first and then maybe Christian to reflect on the situation where we are now. Barbara, please.
Yes, thank you, Zlatko. Good afternoon. Actually, I propose to Zlatko to start with Christian and with the French view in a way of going back to the normal order and the normal pattern that France is first and Germany is second, but of course tries to lead from behind. What is behind us are the amazing elections in France. The results were very much welcomed in Germany for two reasons. First reason is, I think that it gave proof that you can win elections with a pro-European agenda. And the second is, I hope that I do not misread the result, that also the citizens endorsed the reform agenda, but maybe that is up to further debate. And for Europe, this of course means that France is back, and also the perspective of a more symmetric kind of leadership. This does not mean that automatically Germany and France will converge on a lot of issues. We discussed the long list of problems and challenges, but there is a new plateau, I would say, to start from to tackle these problems. And we all know from the German, French and European EU history that it's always a challenge to find compromises and also to get the support from the whole of the European Union. And that is maybe something which will not, to my mind, change irrespective of I think it's not the question who will lead the next government, but the composition of the coalition. That there is a preference in Germany to have an inclusive approach, and that might make a difference to France. So differentiated integration is always a second best, and it's a pragmatic way to deal with issues, but it's not a vision for a strategic goal to have, let's say, a strong kind of, or really structured kind of differentiation. And I think that apart from the, I think, very positive first visit of Macron to Berlin and the meeting between the two heads, state and government, we can say that in Germany prevails, apart from the now campaign for the elections, some sort of wait-and-see attitude. So the Chancellery, and I would say also the Foreign Ministry, and maybe it's also true for some of the think tanks, they are not laboratories of new ideas for the agenda. And I think also Macron, he recycled a lot of what is already on the table. But I would say, in a more optimistic note, these proposals are again, and ideas are on the table, and we now have far better conditions to tackle them. And I think that is something which we should not underestimate. Some call it only psychology and atmosphere, but I think that Macron makes the impression on the political class and many observers in Germany that he can be trusted, that he has the will to reform. And I think that is really a political capital which he owes, and which is new after, I would say, 5 lost years as far as Franco-German cooperation in terms of a proactive approach is concerned. Of course, there was cooperation, etc., and the routine meetings. Some colleagues call it the embedded bilateralism. So you can't really break out of what has been established in Franco-German cooperation, but it was not a very productive, I would say, period. And now we are entering a new period, and I think we will talk about more specific policies later on.
François? Christian. Sorry.
Thank you. Well, no doubt that there is an enormous amount of fresh air in France after this election, and that there is a level of optimism which is going on. But let me say that this level of optimism is not representing the total or the whole society. It's mostly true among the people who supported Mr. Macron. Sociologically, they are urban people. They live in big cities. They believe in social change. They believe in adaptation to globalization, but there's another part of the society which is not exactly on this line, and you can feel it when you look at the arguments by the opposition, both far right and far left, but also if you take into consideration the result of the parliamentary election, 50% of turnout. So I do agree that Mr. Macron is representing a lot of hope, but the job will not be so easy for him, especially when we consider the reforms, but he has the will to reform the country. Regarding Europe, when you look at the French foreign policy in the last 5 years, well, it was mostly crisis management. And we have the impression now that we move again to a sort of a new proactive agenda. And it's true that Macron himself and the people who are around him very much believe in the relationships with Berlin. No doubt about that. If you look at the ministers he appointed, you have some of them who are fluent in German, which is not so frequent in the French government, but it's true for the Minister for Army. It's not defense, it's Army, Mrs. Goulard. It's true for the Minister for Economics, Bruno Le Maire. They speak perfectly French. If you take the diplomatic advisor, he's the former ambassador to Berlin. So they very much believe that if a relaunch of Europe is possible, it has to go with the Germans. You mentioned the visit in Germany. Well, it's not particularly, can I say that, exceptional, because usually elected president, French elected president, the first thing they do when they have a foreign visit, they go to Berlin, right? So, but he went particularly quick, go to Berlin, and what struck me a lot is that. Well, they could have conclusions with Mrs. Merkel which were very soft. No, they went beyond, and they did not exclude treaties reforms, which is something I personally didn't expect it from this first meeting between the president and the chancellor. I don't think having Merkel again or having Mr. Schulz will change a lot in the relationships with the French. Well, it will change a bit regarding some economic aspect, but on the basics, I don't think so. What is at the agenda? Reform of the Eurozone, going again, and of course, considering that the Eurozone shall be the core of political integration. Now there is a big question about, specific institutions for the Eurozone or not, specific budget, etc. Well, those questions, of course, will have to be discussed. Moving in the defense sector, structured cooperation in particular. On Schengen, probably trying to reconsider the Schengen agreement and trying to see how to improve external borders control, because for the moment the situation we have is having more national controls at the national border, but this is something which is not considered as satisfactory. What will be, of course, more difficult is the question of fiscal policy, because this is not a topic on which the Germans are going to move a lot, I don't think there is a huge difference between CDU and SPD, because sometimes when you look at the French debate, people said, well, you know, if the SPD is there, it will be much more flexible, and I think it's a mistake, because on fiscal policy, the SPD is very much on the line of orthodoxy, but of course. That will be a big discussion. The statistics show that the public deficit for this year should be around 3.2%, something like this. You know, so it's not the 3% target, but it's improving. On investments, public investments, what Massimo D'Alema mentioned this afternoon, I think it would be probably easier with the German than on fiscal policy, because the idea of Macron is to push the Juncker program towards more public investments, with this idea that it should have a consequence on the relaunch of growth. Of course, CDU is more nuanced on this question than the SPD, but I think a compromise is probably possible on that aspect. But if you take what is interesting is that if you take the question of reform of Eurozone, trying to make the differentiation more explicit, structured cooperation, reform of Schengen, this is also corresponding to the Schäuble agenda to a certain extent, right? So if you consider a re-election of Mrs. Merkel, I don't think having Schäuble again in the government, because there's a debate about that, will be necessarily a disadvantage for the Franco-German relationships. It could be a good deal, you know, to move forward on the European agenda. So this is the situation, but you see, Europe is definitely back at the core of the French foreign policy, and for the first time in history we have diplomacy, we have the French ambassadors. The ministry is called Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs, so it's Europe first. So let's see what happens.
Okay, before going into some specific issues that you have already mentioned, let's sort of complete this setting the stage, so to speak. Poland, the so-called Weimar Triangle. Poland obviously was very important when Poland was preparing itself for the membership in the European Union. Then in 2016 or something, slightly more ambivalent approach, but then things have now changed. And Weimar Triangle is important for Poland again. Poland would like to play a role in strengthening Europe, and where do you see? And of course, I mean, leadership. Nobody, Franco-German leadership is important, but there are leaderships and leaderships. So I'm just wondering, how do you see it from, let's say, I wouldn't say Polish perspective, but just how would you bring Poland into this debate about leadership?
Thank you very much, Zlatka. I will happily comment on Poland, but just to recall that the EPSC is part of the European Commission, so that's more or less the perspective I would prefer to take here. But I'm not by any means hesitating to answer your question. And as I was listening to Barbara and Christian, I think. Well, the elections are obviously very important, but there are two other things which need to be mentioned, namely that the medicine is beginning to work. I mean, what we have been through in the past 10 years, both in economic terms and more recently when it comes to migration and asylum, is beginning to show effects. Of course, we're not quite there yet, but the very fact that we are growing, the Eurozone is growing at a faster pace than the US, I think is telling. And our prospects are actually better. That is a remarkable change. So that is to sort of pay tribute to what has happened at an enormous cost over the past decade, and I think that's one set of issues. The second set of issues is related to the U.S. elections last year and Brexit. I think there's a powerful impact which both of these are having, because the Europeans have now seen what the counterfactual is like, and they can make a judgment for themselves. And we won't know in very scientific terms, whether this is what skewed some of the elections or not, but it certainly has been important. And the third element is this sort of reinvention of the positive agenda, which we have seen very powerfully in France, but just to be holistic about it, it really started, the trend started in Austria last year with the presidential elections, where there was also a candidate who pursued very wholeheartedly a positive pro-European agenda. Of course, not all 27 countries are on the same wavelength. That's why we have the diversity. But the trend is pretty clear, and of course we need to use that window of opportunity because I mean that's how we should treat it. It's a window. Things are not solved forever. There is a room for coming up with solutions to some of the longer term challenges that Europe faces. And I think what Christian said with respect to the French European policy, namely that was in a crisis management mode, of course applies to most of Europe. And we were in crisis management mode. Sure. And what we now desperately need is to move towards what we are really about, namely management of longer term challenges. And I think I would zoom out a little bit more than the Eurozone, Schengen, and all that, because I think there are some bigger questions which we need to answer. One is resilience to crises in both security and economic terms. And of course, a large part of the Eurozone agenda is about that resilience. But there is also the wholly new project called Security Union that is already proving quite substantive. That was launched after last year's Brussels attacks. There is the whole defense package that President Juncker spoke about here in Prague last week. So that's my sort of resilience basket. I think we need to prop up long-term growth quite desperately, because for a lot of this agenda to make sense, we simply need to be on a higher growth trajectory. We need adjustment of the social model. The Commission's reflection paper on the social dimension is really about that, the changing world of work and how we should adapt to it. There is the question of embracing technological change. I mean, a lot of what we are seeing out there in the society and in globalization has to do with technological change. Globalization has changed irreplaceably after about 1990, when it started to become knowledge-driven, which means that a lot of high value-added activity can be much more easily outsourced to third countries. Before about 1990, it was mainly production lines that were outsourced, but the brains stayed behind. And that was a model that worked fine for advanced economies. It became much more challenging since the ICT revolution kicked in, because the outsourcing of higher value added became easier. And finally, there is the sustainability challenge that we are, of course, grappling with in the context of what happens to what happened with the U.S. decision to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. It acquires a new meaning because, of course, we want to be and we will be faithful to the agenda, but we also need to make sure that that there are no additional economic costs to it. So to sum up, I see sort of a mixture of a completion agenda, and I see also huge scope for an innovative agenda, but it's about more than the binary choice: more integration, less integration. I think that's the point that the Commission's white paper on the future of Europe also makes. I think we're beyond that stage where it's simply about more integration and less integration. We have to come up with more innovative solution. Happily, one word about Poland, since you asked. And it's a country I know reasonably well. I think Poland is in a period of introversion, let's call it that way. I tend to look at things in a longer term framework, and when I look at the 28 years since 1989, Poland has been pro-European for about 25 out of these 28. and it has been Eurosceptical for about 3. I mean, that clock is ticking. I'm aware of that. But also the other 25 years are deeply relevant. And I think it's not before this period of introspection ends that Poland will be ready to rejoin the leadership club with those who are now in that position.
And obviously there are also other larger countries that clearly would also have to be addressed at one point or the other. But going more to more specifics, as has already been said, Nicole, if we go to sort of security defense area first, so what is the potential and impact of the current Franco-German drive behind developing the EU's security and defense policy?
Well, I mean, I think it has been mentioned before that this has been one of the areas where a lot of things have moved, and I would, I think, slightly disagree in this particular domain that it was 5 lost years, because what you could see was really a strong Franco-German proposals. You had the Steinmeier-Evro paper just as a reaction to Brexit. You had the paper by von der Leyen and Le Drian, and these papers outline some of the key proposals that are actually now being discussed. I mean, these are all not new proposals, but they're proposals that at the moment can be tabled because of certain external factors, because of Trump, because of Russia, because of Brexit. So I think there is a strong drive behind these proposals, and I think you can also see that there were already some deliverables in this field. I mean, if you think about the fact that now we have a political compromise on the headquarters that cannot be called a headquarters, so this military planning and conduct capability, this is something that the EU has been discussing for about 15 years. And finally, I think, and this is part of this Franco-German drive, that there is finally a political agreement on this particular field. Then, as you mentioned, there is permanent structured cooperation. Again, it's not a new topic, but it has been tabled again, very strongly so, also by France and Germany. Here, I think there's still a question how much can actually be done. I think perhaps we should be also a bit cautious in terms of optimism, because if you see, and you have alluded to it, there are still different visions about permanent structured cooperation in France and Germany. And in France, you have very much this idea it has to be an ambitious project, even if that's perhaps less inclusive. And in Germany, you have this feeling, no, it has to be inclusive. PESCO at 27 would be the best option if we can do it. And I think you do have these differences. And what is interesting to see in the defense area, I think, is that you have a sort of reversal of roles between France and Germany if you compare it to the Eurozone. Because France in the area of defense is basically saying we should have high entry criteria, we should really stick to the treaty, we should stick to the protocol, and convergence should happen before entering a core defense union. And the German variant of that is, no, let's keep the criteria low, and let's keep as many member states as possible on board, and then perhaps we can find to convergence within this permanent structured cooperation. So I think this is still an open question. I think there's a lot of political will to move forward, also even to move forward perhaps until the end of this year, because there's this vision that if we have this done before the next German government, then we will move forward quickly. But it's still an open question whether it will happen. Another open question is the European Defence Fund. Of course, there are the proposals by the Commission, but still there are some open questions. So for example, where will the money come from? Can there be some specific debt-related projects within this defense fund? What exactly is going to be the role of the European Commission? Here I think we have also a skeptical France that says, well, how much of a role will the Commission have, and to what extent will the Commission proposals cater rather to the industry than to strategic interests? So we have a lot of open questions also still in this domain. But overall, I think it's a moment of opportunity. There's a window of opportunity that should be used. There's a lot of political pressure in Germany there's this feeling that this is one of the areas where we can deliver in the European context and where we should deliver soon. But yeah, there's still some small risk, I think, that that perhaps, for example, the discussion on permanent structured cooperation that has run into a dead end before will do so again. So yeah, still a bit of caution. I think in terms of the Weimar triangle that you have mentioned, what we have seen, particularly in the area of defense, is that we have this format of the Weimar Plus, but without Poland. So basically we have the Franco-German proposals, which are backed by Spain and Italy, but Poland is not sitting at the table. And I think this is also a key concern for Berlin, to really think how can we get Poland on board, because obviously Poland has been a little bit difficult on certain of the proposals. It's a bit skeptical about the common annual review on defense. So there are certain issues, and it's really an open question that you hear in Germany a lot.
Christian, you wanted to say something?
On this topic?
Yeah.
No, it's okay. I don't.
It's okay. Do you want to comment?
I fully agree. I think the picture is very valid, that defense area is now more, let's say, an area where positions seem to converge, because I would say because of external pressure. And of course it's also the area where, even more so after Brexit, France has the upper hand, I would say, in the relationship.
Christian?
No, it's absolutely obvious that there are some expectations regarding Germany, and of course we have to put it also in the context of Brexit, because one of the two main contributors of European defense is leaving the United Kingdom. Even if the United Kingdom is going to have probably arrangements with the European Union on this question of defense, and particularly with France, because you have bilateral agreement, you have the Lancaster House Agreement of 2010. But we could feel in Paris this expectation that the Germans do more in terms of investing in the defense, etc. Something which exists also at the level of the elites in Germany. When you take the debates in think tanks, when you look at a certain number of declarations which have been done in the last 2 years by Mr. Gauck when he was president, by Mr. von der Leyen, by Mr. Steinmeier, etc. The problem is, what about the legitimacy of that in the German society, which is for me the big issue. But of course, when we listen to increase of the budget of the Bundeswehr and things like that, which was the case last year, all the things are considered as positive steps. It's interesting, because it gives the impression that the Germans are already more reluctant vis-à-vis their own history than the rest of the Europeans are. You know what I mean? Regarding Germany, you know what I mean. But this is probably the effect of transmitting this idea that the military is not our priority in education, school, etc. For 60 years now in Germany.
Nicole has mentioned earlier the other story, obviously, which is the Eurozone, which we are going to tackle a little bit later. But let's stick to the defense and security first. Pavel, you want to say something?
I think in defense and security there are really remarkable things which are happening, and of course European Defence Fund is not everything, but investing so much in research and development will make European Defence Funds one of the key actors in the field in Europe. So it's not negligible. Capability has been around for or the headquarters has been around for years, and what we have lost in the meantime is institutional memory, because of course headquarters have been appointed on an ad hoc basis for each of the operations, and that's really the meaning of having the headquarters for me in the first place. We can continue with the current system that when we have a mission, we appoint, we look for a willing member state to host it. But what we are losing in between the lines is the institutional memory, because people don't have the experience that they can pass on to others. So the capability, I think, is the right start. And generally, I think we're getting the sequencing right on defense right now. Also for these domestic purposes, in order to legitimize what is happening. Because if you start with research and development, I mean, you cannot argue that this is about Europe becoming a military power. So it's a long way to go before that happens. So I think the sequencing is right.
Mm-hmm. Nicole?
Yeah, just to attach to that, really, I think that what we are seeing is really an incremental approach. For example, with the headquarters issue, I mean, we will have a review of the headquarters in 2018. And obviously, I think there can be still some different perspectives after Brexit on a sort of phase 2 of this headquarters, where perhaps the scope is a bit bigger. And similarly, I think we have these different elements. So we have PESCO, we have CARD, we have the European Defence Fund. And I think in the next step, it's really about connecting these measures. And this is something that at the moment, because PESCO is a little bit uncertain, member states are still a bit reluctant to connect them. But I think this is kind of next step in some ways. But I wanted to come back to something what you said. And I think that on the one hand, we have, of course, high expectations from France for Germany to do more. And I think there is this whole idea of more international responsibility. There's higher defense spending. There are certain measures, for example, that Germany is participating in the anti-Daesh coalition in a military way. So there are actually some steps. Also, for example, what is often mentioned, has been mentioned also by Macron, is the fact that Germany is a big contributor to EUTM Mali, so playing a role in the Sahel. But I still think that, coming back to what you said, that there is a certain reluctance in the German public concerning playing a bigger military role. And I think as soon as it is perceived that France is sort of dragging Germany into an African adventure, then for sure this reluctant and a little bit slow and cautious Germany will be back on the table. So I think there might be still some friction along these a little bit old lines, even though, and I want to state that as well, I think there is some strategic convergence between Germany and France, particularly surrounding Africa, for different reasons. Because for Germany it was mainly because of the migration issue. For France it's a whole different issue with a very important historical component. There is some strategic convergence, but nevertheless I would be I would be a little bit cautious concerning the whole military issue, military crisis management issue.
Still within the security and defense field, any questions from the audience? Go ahead, over there. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Benjamin Tallis from the Institute of International Relations here in Prague. Thank you to the panelists for the detailed and nuanced comments on particular policy areas. But this is a conversation about the future of Europe. Quite a big topic, and I would like you, if you can, to perhaps connect what you're saying a little bit more to bigger visions of the future of Europe, to the kind of future we talk about as a progressive future, a future that is better than the past, the kind of future that we've perhaps lost a little bit in the European imagination over the last 10, 15 years. We could see an earlier loss of that perhaps in Western Europe, a slightly later loss of that in a lot of Central and East European countries. But how do we go about actually recapturing that future and recapturing the imagination culturally, politically, socially, economically, when we have a discussion of the kind that we hear on this stage, and how do we connect the two together? Thank you.
Okay, one more. Yes, please. Over there, the lady.
Sophia Besch from the Centre for European Reform in London. Perhaps following up from that question, talking about Paris and Berlin, sometimes France, I think, is seen in Germany as a necessary balancer to German leadership in Europe, to prevent a sort of backlash against Germany as the sole European leader. How do you think that Paris and Berlin can capture the imagination of the South and the East? How can they bring the rest of Europe with them if they want to lead?
Okay, shall we give it a go? Anyone wants to kick off first?
I do first.
Baba?
Okay, I try on the big
Go ahead.
on the big issue of future of Europe. I think I start with quoting Delors. He said, "To build Europe, you need a vision and a screwdriver." And I think over the last terms of Chancellor Merkel, Germany was more on the side of the screwdriver. And it was said Germany has become far more pragmatic. Also, I would say when I think of the February agreement with the UK, Germany has become more permissive on lots of principles. And one is that there is this very ambivalent goal of ever closer union. That was at least something like the lowest common denominator. We know there were different interpretations of what it would mean, but there was still, I would say, some sort of a federal glue even in the German discourse. And when you now listen to Mr. Schulz, you get still an idea of it. But basically, Germany ran through the Politik crisis over the last decade on limiting the damages, trying to protect the acquis, trying to move here and there where it's possible ahead, but without very, I would say, clear strategic goals, and very cautious as far as huge projects are concerned. And that, of course, has some reasons, because we have a lot of unfinished business. And the areas where the crisis came up were all very ambitious projects: monetary union, the justice and home affairs area, Schengen area, where we had this multi-speed approach, some as a pioneering group with criteria to join these groupings, and an enormous lack of implementation and playing by the rules. And that is what made, and I think also in the future will make up a lot of, at least from a Berlin point of view, the agenda to see where it's only about implementing what's there, and where you have to revise maybe here and there and add to it. And one of the obvious areas is, of course, the Eurozone. And I think I don't share the perception that necessarily, quite naturally, the political core must be the Eurozone for the future of Europe. You can debate that, and I think when you talk to people in Warsaw, they have a very different view on that, because of course they are non-Eurozone members, but maybe they also have a different idea of the future. But Eurozone is still one of the areas where it's about completing what has been begun, and maybe also modifying the original design of the Eurozone, adding to it new elements. The institutional front, just talk about the finance, Eurozone finance minister, the fiscal capacity, having a budget, having a special assembly, parliament, whatsoever, to oversee decisions that have been taken. And I would say that again, Germany will be more open to discuss it, but might rely on let's say, the old principles which we discussed the panel before. And here I think Germany will not just skip its old beliefs, and I think, Christian, you are absolutely right. This is not a question of Christian Democrats or Social Democrats. It's also widely, you say, the ordo-liberalism widely supported by the public. And so we will again have not a battle, but maybe quite a debate about different views on how to interpret the principles that are there. And of course, it's a fiscal discipline, which is far more it's higher valued in Germany. Little political discretion for whatsoever body. Some sort of more, I would say, legalistic approach. And that would mean that on a different level we come back to different views. And the question is whether Germany and France and maybe some other countries, and I would see Italy as one of the, let's say, countries with which the two could look at shaping a kind of package which would not only consist on Eurozone but defense and refugee, etc., to make it acceptable. And that would also be the question how to engage more than just the two, which would be able to engage non-Eurozone members, but also southern countries like Italy. So this is a huge task, and maybe that leads us again, or puts us again on the track towards, I would still say, ever closer union, with all the ambiguities that have always been in that formula. But I do not see really, let's say, inside the EU 27, an alternative vision that would really encompass the majority, at least, of the member states. And nobody wants to leave. So I take it that the future means 27 for the next 10 years or so.
And if I can just add to this, it wasn't me who said first that Europe, ever closer union, will be based on concrete practical achievements, right? This has been 60 years old statement.
Yeah, still true.
So indeed, I mean, Eurozone, Christian, I mean, obviously France wanted common currency, right? And so now, obviously, economic performance is really nothing to be compared with German performance, right? It's really lagging behind. So how do you, and Nicole was talking about, you know, two different narratives when it comes to defense and the Eurozone. How do you see the questions that were asked? How do you see the vision whereby France would, you know, that France would also sort of, I don't know if the word is right, but compromise and, you know, open up its own economy to be more competitive, not to be restricted to, let's say, the rights that trade unions have and so on?
Okay. Can I just answer the question which was asked by Benjamin first, because there was a question about the vision of the future, which is a very French question usually. So it's interesting that it's a Brit who asked this question. You know, one of my British friends would say, "If you have a vision, go immediately to your GP." You know, It's very much linked, I think, to the question of economic recovery, and this is a big challenge for Macron, for instance. He who wants to reconnect, reluctant part of the society, people who do not believe in the political system, who have strong problem with unemployment, who are living in mid-cities, etc. I don't think he has a lot of solutions. it will be extremely difficult to reconnect them on the theme of identity, migration, etc. The only thing is reducing unemployment and showing that he's successful in his economic reform. The only problem is that it takes time, you know. So you don't deliver in economy in 3 months. You need a bit of time. But if we go to the European level and we see the level of unemployment among young people, the problem of economic convergence, we have a big debate, you know, on this question of seconded workers. And this is something Macron would like to put at the agenda. But if you take this problem, well, in fact it's a problem of economic convergence, because it's the problem of salaries in the new member states, and this is perceived as negative, you know. You remember the way enlargement was sold to people in 2004. We're going to recover the economic level. We're going to, well, and it's not the case, right? And in the old member states, it's perceived as a problem of social dumping, you know. But it's exactly the two coins of the same problem, which is the problem of the lack of convergence. So that has to be addressed. And to answer your question also about the message to the south and the message to the east. I don't know what's the east. I prefer Central Europe than Eastern Europe, but okay. Two things. First of all, for the French and the Germans, very important to have a clear discourse that leadership does not mean hegemony, because we can understand that there is a sensitivity to this question of hegemony, directoire, etc., etc. And second, a discourse on solidarity, especially coming from the German side, because the problem of Germany is vis-à-vis the South is mostly a problem of narrative. It's not a problem of policies. The Germans never stopped the financial transfers, never. But they have a strong narrative. So this is something. If Mr. Schäuble is in the government again in October, this is something he has to think about. And because he's a very intelligent man, I'm sure he will think about that.
Okay. I missed there was one very good question on the board, but it's gone, maybe because it turned out to be less relevant, but I'll try to sort of repeat it. It has to do something, it was a kind of a provocative question about, well, there is a convergence, the idea of convergence between France and Germany with regards to the Eurozone. Where does Greece come into this? The Greece problem. So this is a very sort of provocative but practical question as well. I mean, what do we do with Greece? Would you want to do this, Paul?
I think where it comes in is through the need for revival of the convergence agenda, because
exactly.
what Christian referred to is more the symptom. So the posting of workers causing sort of emotions here and there, because Central Europe in particular has made out of low wages its competitive asset. And what it needs to do is needs to move along the value curve and build competitiveness in other fields. That's a long-term project, but that's what needs to happen. But the convergence agenda needs to be revived because it has stopped. I mean, we had convergence before the crisis. Some of it was based on unsustainable grounds. Since we have had the slowing down of convergence of Central Europe and the stopping or reversing of the convergence in Southern Europe. So that's also answer to Sophia's question in broader terms, namely what's the offer for the East and the South. The offer should be to revive the convergence agenda, and there are various ways of doing that. The Commission in its latest paper speaks mostly about structural convergence. So you need to, first of all, improve the functioning of your economy before you can do anything else. Fiscal capacity can help, but not as long as you have a more fundamental problem with the structure of the economy. I mean, look at the Greek export performance, largely flat since 2008, in spite of massive internal devaluation. Why? Because, as the economist would say, Greece specializes in stagnant export markets. That's a very nice way of putting it, but what it means is that it doesn't really have the products and services which nowadays sell in the global economy. So that's a more fundamental problem that needs to be solved. So if France and Germany converge together with the institutions around this convergence agenda, I think this would be of huge value added.
Good. Any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
This is Metropolitan University Prague. My question is for Christian and Nicole, because it has to do with the security defense and the role of Germany and France within the context of security and defense. And I was wondering, taking into consideration being the Brexit, in the case of France, whether there is actually a plan B in the case that Germany is not willing or politically willing or publicly ready to get the role of co-leader when it comes to common security and defense policy. So is there more or less in the mind of Paris political elites an idea about who can actually replace France in the case, Germany in the case of such a scenario? Because and I would also like us to remember that CSTP is more about civilian missions rather than military operations. And when it comes to civilian missions, there we can see lots of potential players in the field. And it's not only France or Germany or even the UK. Thank you very much. It's a very interesting point.
It's true. Nicole?
Who can replace Germany? I mean, I think that Germany is there are actually natural partners in bringing forward the CSDP at the moment. And as you mentioned, civilian missions, I really don't think that civilian missions are a German problem. I think, to the contrary, this is something that Germany usually tends to push. Also, if you have discussions about a civil-military headquarters, for example, Germany will always push the civilian side in some ways, and is very much in line with certain Nordic countries on that. So I think in this domain, there is no other partner needed. Perhaps what I was referring to earlier as well is will France always find a partner in Germany when it comes to sort of tricky missions, operations in Africa? And I think there, of course, they can also take place outside of the CSDP. I mean, we've seen it in the case of Libya, for example, where there was a very strong Franco-British couple, and I mean, you hear it as well when you listen to Macron, who says, well, I'm very much in favor of pushing for l'Europe de la défense, but at the same time, we still have to connect very much with the British, and I think this is also with a view to that. But in terms of institutional development of the CSDP, bringing the structures forward, bringing PESCO forward, bringing the European Defence Fund forward, I think Germany remains a natural partner, together with others, because of course Italy is also very interested in this domain, Spain is very interested, we've heard before, Czech Republic is also interested in being a driver in this field. So it's not the only game in town, but it's an important couple to bring this CSDP development further, I think.
Mm-hmm. Before giving you word, Christian, there is a question on the board that's directly related, or at least to some extent related to that. The role of V4. So also, how it says, how does it shape the future of the EU? But essentially, I think it can extend to security and defense as well. So I don't know if you want to throw this in. It's the first one on the top. Christian.
Shape the future. Well. Yes, regional groupings, of course, they're very important in the dynamic of EU negotiation, and this is not something new. we need some privilege relationships inside the EU to introduce some dynamic, etc. Regarding V4, situation is absolutely difficult for the moment. That's my view, and because V4, the difference between V4 and, for instance, the Franco-German relationships is that V4 functions if there is an agreement between the four countries right from the beginning. And it's not necessarily the case for the Franco-German relationships. In the Franco-German relationships, you could have compromise if you start with different positions, you know. And this is why with Poland and Hungary for the moment, and Slovakia to a certain extent, it's extremely difficult to move forward with the V4. So everything now depends on the Czechs. That's that's my conclusion. It's a joke. It's a joke. But it's interesting because on the other way, I think the West is always trying to find among the V4, you know, the one which can push the others, or we can go to the direction they consider positive. For the moment, it's clearly Czech Republic, which is considered like this. Yesterday, it was Poland when platform was there. You know,
that's the beauty of the EU.
So, there is always a Musterknabe, as the Germans will say.
Okay, Nicole wants to add to.
No, I mean it's very much in line with what you said. I think, well, my impression, maybe I'm wrong as well, is that the V4 was very unified in the field of migration. That there has been a very strong common positioning. There has been a strong voice that has also been heard. In other areas, there are actually, as you described it, there's the Musterknabe, or they are actually divided. For example, also concerning two speeds and the Eurozone. Of course, it's very different if you ask people from Slovakia than people from Poland, for example. Also in the area of defense and security, it's very different whether you ask at the moment the Poles or the Czechs. So I would agree that there are few issues where there's really unified bloc, although they have a voice in terms of more flexible integration. I think they are a little bit sometimes playing the British card in that sense, that you know, opposing the bloc of the founding members of ever deeper, ever closer union.
Okay, question, go ahead. Yeah. That's,
European Institute Renaissance, settled in Prague. I think Czechs need the vision of Europe, and they cannot deliver themselves. So I ask all of you to qualify the vision, because President Macron said very well, refondation d'Europe, because we cannot go by the bicycle with all the burdens of past years of reconciliation. So if you see the same chance as saw fathers of Europe in 50s to really define Europe as the pole of the world, as one of the maybe the most important pole of the world, because all the others, Africans, Asians, China, India, Brasilia, the others are looking with hope to European Union, because it's only a strong player who can deliver the vision even for the whole world. But for sure, I think we cannot deliver anything without making the vision for ourselves. And like Europe in the world, I see the Czechs in Europe. So we can help, but we cannot do ourselves. You should give us some notes, and then maybe we shall define more. So if you can tell from your side how you see this Refondation d'Europe is only the social pillar, it's only defense, or it's something which will combine all these efforts around to do a nice future for at least 2-3 decades. Thank you.
Okay, the question over there by the window. Yeah.
Sebastian Puchennik, Polish Institute of International Affairs. My question concerns Ukraine, which belongs to Europe as well. And just this week, Ukrainians are allowed to travel to European Union countries without a visa. And my question is that everything we can offer them at this stage of integration in the coming years? Or maybe there are some bigger plans possible? Thank you.
Like
Okay, one more over there, just the last row, and then we will have another round, yes.
David Kadi, associate at LSE London School of Economics. The title of the panel is Still Leading Together. So I was trying to think when Berlin and Paris actually led the EU together recently, and maybe the one topic that came most clearly is actually Russia and the sanctions regime. Because this was quite a difficult topic to unify the Europeans. We know that because of history, geography, politics, whatever, the positions are very different. But nonetheless, contrary to what most have been expecting, including the Europeans themselves, for 2 years, the EU member states have been renewing the sanctions until the Minsk agreements are actually implemented. So my question to the panel is, what lessons do you derive from EU-Russia relations, from the Ukraine peace process, from the sanctions regime in terms of how Berlin and Paris can lead and can bring together Europeans even on topics they disagree? In other words, why did it work this time? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And just to this, and then I will let all the panelists to answer, pick up whatever they want to emphasize. The question from the board, the last one, how do you see the EU defense project in the context of NATO? So that is also something that you might address. Barbara, may I start with you?
Yeah, maybe I pick up on the question on EU-Russia relations. Why did it work? That the 27, 28 were unified. I think it was important that Germany had a very strict position, to the surprise of some of the other EU members, and continued to do so. Maybe it's wrong, but there is an overall view in Germany that at that moment Germany invented the Normandy format to have France on board and keep them on board, but it was not a very, let's say, a very active French role. And I think it worked within the EU framework more comprehensively, because there was some sort of, how can I call it, some sort of feedback loop with the European Council. So it was not, let's say, isolated and diplomacy only of the bigger EU member states, but there was always some sort of, let's say, feedback and having positions taken in this format being endorsed also by all of them. But of course it becomes, I think, increasingly difficult given the also varying economic impact and different views on the role of Russia in Europe and how to integrate even a difficult partner like Russia in an overall security framework in Europe. So that's on with a link to Germany and France. Of course, it's a bigger issue. I think the Macron and the refoundation of Europe, that is, as far as I see it, not really taken up in the German debate. This does not resonate very well. That we are, let's say, in a situation where you try again to construct the EU from scratch, or where you have now a period of in-depth reconsidering the fundamentals of European integration. So it's more consolidation on the one part, yes, and in that sense, we of course would say we should be aware of our own principles, and that is why, for example, rule of law mechanism, etc., is important, although Germany is very much on the sidelines, because Germany, I think the German government thinks when it is more vocal on all these issues that this would be counterproductive, but it is very much, let's say, positive to address these issues, but in a very diplomatic way, and having the Commission doing its part here. So that means basically it's far more incremental again, the overall approach, but, and that is new, and that was, I think, mentioned by Christian, but with a new perspective that we have not just to defend the status quo, but Lisbon is not the final settlement of the whole, let's say, EU architecture. We can go ahead, treaty reform, but not so much because Germans like institutional engineering and constitutionalization processes, etc., but because we have an agenda for it. So it's, I think, what do we want? That's on the agenda, and there we expect, I would say also, maybe I said from a personal point of view, more contributions also from smaller, medium-sized countries. I would say that, for example, Poland, whatever the rifts and conflicts now are, could take a far more proactive role and give an input also to that debate, or from Italy and Spain. So my impression, Christian, is not that the directoire is now feared, but there is I would say, some sort of phlegmatic wait-and-see attitude in many other member states, waiting for countries to lead, when there is, I would say, a real chance to make a contribution and influence the whole discourse. I think that for different reasons, France and Germany will be receptive to take that up. And that is because of Germany, for many reasons, cannot escape its centrist role, which it has to play. And so I think there is a chance also for us today and tomorrow to make an input.
Okay. Nicole, do you want to have something?
What do we do with the EU defense in the context of NATO? I mean, I think it's actually quite fortunate that we have several processes going on at the same time. So we have the process launched by the External Action Service in the member states. We have the process launched by the Commission, which is the European Defence Fund and all of this. And we have the EU-NATO implementation plan. And all of these processes are working in parallel. And I think one of the also priorities of the German government is to really make sure that whatever is done in the European context will not duplicate NATO. If you ask people in France, but you would know better, perhaps it's okay, we have to not unnecessarily duplicate NATO, with a view to, if the Americans and NATO don't want to go in a certain area, the Europeans should still be able to go. But I think this is very much on the agenda, and I think there's a very close connection also between the High Representative and the NATO Secretary General on these issues, to really ensure maximum exchange of information and transparency. Just a quick point on the issue of sanctions and Russia. I think I think what you said is absolutely correct. But I think one element that also always helped, as far as I understand, was actually the UK's role, working in the background to ensure continuity, unity on the sanctions dossier. This is always something that people mention from either side, both the British and the EU27, that this will be a loss for the EU, this whole role in the sanctions regime, also regarding Syria, of course. Okay. I think just on the concrete projects versus vision, My impression is as well that at the moment, perhaps it's not so much about formulating a grand vision. I mean, in some sense, the vision is a little bit dictated by the outside, by saying, okay, Europe is the last stronghold of liberal values and all of this. And I think this is something that, for example, Germans can identify with. I think it's really more about concrete projects. And I think this is also what the Commission tries to outline in the reflection papers, that you really go issue area by issue area and see these are scenarios, which ones could be implemented in the next years, which ones require treaty change. And as you said, Barbara, treaty change, I think there is an openness in Germany, but only, well, it's a question of timing. When would be the good moment for treaty change and for what purpose?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, Pavel?
I think when it comes to the vision, we sort of broadly agree that we want to have inclusive and sustainable prosperity, which is anchored in liberal democracy. And then there are nuances as to what emphasis each of us would place on the given aspect. The refondation debate, I think, is more for the national arena, because this is where things often got difficult. Of course, they then converge at the European level, but we've had so many different narratives about Europe responding to the different national needs, and that's probably fine. That's inevitable, as long as they are at least compatible with each other. And then, of course, there is this broader phenomenon of division between those who believe in openness and those who believe in nativism, and Europe has been used in this debate as sort of an exemplification of openness. I think we are moving beyond that stage, luckily. But the big question is whether Europe will function in a post-consensual reality in which the majority is still supportive, but there's a big minority that is disinterested, at least, if not opposed, or if we can rebuild a broader consensus and a broader common denominator, which can appeal to broadly everybody. To everybody is impossible, but to a greater majority. I think we should make an effort to do the latter, namely to rebuild something that everyone will feel part of. Yeah, so that's on refondation. On defense, I mean, I would just draw attention to the fact that NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg has endorsed very strongly the defense package last week in a tweet, sign of the times. And this is a sea change compared to 10 years ago in the Berlin summit, when the idea of the headquarters was launched, because then it was very much seen in opposition to NATO. Now it's nothing of the kind. So.
Christian?
Yes, I'm starting with Mr. Kaplan's question on the relationships between refondation and Czech Republic. First of all, personally, I prefer reform to refondation. That's my personal opinion. And when we look at this question of reform, I don't think it should be only the reform of the Eurozone. It should be a package, where you have, of course, the Eurozone, where you have the defense agenda, where you have the new Schengen agreement. Well, it should be something holistic, something which constitute a package, because if you want to create compromises, if you want to establish compromise, you need to make also linkages between the different files. You know what I mean? And regarding Czech Republic, of course, a lot will also depend on your election, which will take place in October. But if a pro-European government is reconducted after the October election, and if there is at the agenda of the EU a real debate about improving the Eurozone, then it will immediately, I think, put again on the domestic agenda of Czech Republic the question of membership to Euro. That's something which will have to be addressed probably in the future. Question from our Polish colleague on Ukraine, can we go beyond a visa-free policy? That's mostly your question. Well, I haven't thought in details about that, but one thing I think we have to avoid is to promise membership, because if we promise membership and then we are not able to deliver, then it's terrible. It's creating a huge level of frustration, which is excellent for nationalism, etc., etc. But for the moment, I think it would be not wise to promise membership, because we have difficulties to deal with the current processes. Look at West Balkans, you know, and it's to a certain extent it's a sad story. But if you look at the opinion polls, well, there is no support for new membership. Very interesting to look at, because you come from Slovenia, to look at the Austrian surveys. There was a huge support to membership of Croatia and Slovenia in Austria. Look at the support to the membership of Serbia, Macedonia or Montenegro. Well, there's a majority of the Austrians against, right? So it's probably something we'll have to address in the future. What could be the alternatives to membership? And if we have a general reflection about multi-speed Europe, etc., we'll have to also to think about alternatives to membership. What kind of alternatives do exist? What is acceptable, not acceptable, etc. This is something which is missing, because for the moment it's membership or nothing to a certain extent, and we need some intermediary solutions, and we will need them more and more, I think.
But since you've mentioned it, and since I am coming from the region, and it is actually one of the questions that I'm pretty sure is also relevant in terms of stability of the European Union. You said, well, we have to think in other terms, not just membership. Precedent has already been set anyway with Turkey, so we know that. But in the Western Balkans, at least, in Ukraine, I'm sure is the same thing. I mean, they have been taught, they have been, you know, it's a learning process, you know, that the accomplishment being part of the European Union is a full membership. Now, if we know, as you say, it's a sad story in the Western Balkans. I mean, the conflict is actually simmering. So, God forbid something happens. I mean, how would one have to accept the narrative? Well, you know, it's not our problem. Well, you know, actually, it is our problem. Maybe it's also part of our guilt because we haven't been more proactive in terms of, you know, giving a more determined European perspective. Or is it basically one should blame squarely? The blame should be put squarely on the region being maybe not too flexible, or you know, well, more, let's say, proactive in terms of fulfilling acquis communautaire or something. I mean, maybe this is more question for you, Pavel, than.
I think one needs to have a sense of direction, and this is probably what also the question on Ukraine referred to. I mean, we've just had a very torturous process of ratifying the enhanced trade agreement. So the Dutch Parliament is just
it's over.
It's over. So definitely there is no readiness to immediately move ahead. I can report what I keep on hearing in the debates, namely that, for example, a very useful next step could be thinking about a customs union. I don't think it's for the immediate agenda for the reason I just mentioned. But customs union would indeed make a lot of sense from the point of view of also addressing some of the corruption problems in the customs services, and generally to make this economic exchange work much better. So a sense of direction is definitely needed, but it needs to be adapted to each country's individual pace, and definitely there should be no shortcuts.
Okay. We have maybe one more question, very quick question. You have been very persistent, so go ahead.
It's true that the British are terrible, and they'll tell you to go to the doctor if you say you've got a vision. If you're a French person with a vision, they'll tell you to change your optician as well. But vision is important. If it's not going to come from above in Europe, will it come from below? There are civil society organisations here, like mine, New Europeans, who are very keen to frame a vision from below for the future of Europe. How open are the French and the German governments to working with civil society organisations, and reviving this idea of a Europe of the citizens and getting a vision for Europe articulated from below? As we've heard today, it's unlikely to come from above.
Okay. Who would like to answer this one? Anyone?
Well,
okay, Barbara.
Well, I think Germany has quite a record in subsidizing non-governmental pro-European organizations. So European Movement, for example, in Germany has always been funded also with public money. And it is the raison d'être that is part of let's say, the agenda of all the German governments in the past. But the problem is we now also have Pulse of Europe and lots of people who get together on Sundays, and they show that it's not only those who are against the EU or skeptical as far as EU integration is concerned that have a voice in public and in the media, but that there are also substantial parts of the citizens who differ, I guess, on many concrete issues, but basically the overall orientation is pro-EU. But again, when you go there, you meet people like those who vote for Macron, the people living in urban surroundings, better educated, maybe also more open, outward-looking as far as their private life is concerned. So they have the typical background, which is labeled as elitist, and those who benefit from the EU, and not those who do not see what they get out of it. So you have again this kind of split, and the problem is that also they, just like the elite, do not really reach out to the, don't know how many they are. But that is still, I would say, a big challenge, but of course it also contributes to a different, I would say, mood, overall atmosphere, and it also makes people think more, and I think Brexit was a case in point, what you can lose when you're not member of the European Union again. So how deep going into, let's say, normal lives being part of European integration has become. And it's not only part of the constitution, which the UK, I think, now realizes, of the practical daily constitution, but also of the ordinary lives. And I think that is something which is now, I think, also more publicized. So there is, I think, a better attention given to, let's say, the impact also of statements, of policies on the wider public.
Okay, so the first word was given to Germany. The last word will be given to France.
Okay. Well, I think there's a lot of connection established between the civil society in Great Britain and the other countries of the continent. If you look at academic networks, if you look at cities partnership, I'm myself the vice president of a partnership committee in my city, and one of our best partners is the city of Richmond in England, and we will continue to have contacts with Richmond, in the future. So of course we understand that the support is very important for people, you know, in the UK who were in favor of remaining, because we shall never forget that 48% of the Brits were in favor of remaining. No, we're talking only about, we're all the time about the 52%. And I can tell you that in our milieu, in the academic milieu, most of my British colleagues, you know, I have contacts with, they're absolutely desperate by Brexit. So it would be a very negative sign just to tell them, you know, because of Brexit we stop working with you. No, not at all. We're going to continue. And nobody knows what about the future. Well, as British citizens, you probably observe that the people between 18 and 24, those who went to the polling station, because I know that there's a high level of abstention among the young people, but those who went there, they voted 73% against Brexit. So maybe this question of membership will be put again at the agenda in the future, but that shall be a British debate.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Okay, we are almost, well, we actually already passed our time. Just three things to say before we thank our panelists. Obviously, I think one of the consensus, or rather one of the, I guess, majority views would still be that, yes, France and Germany would lead. That would be a responsible lead. Obviously, it should not and probably will not be exclusionary lead. But, of course, the rest of the membership has to understand that this cannot be close to zero-sum or zero-sum policy. This is a teamwork, it's a partnership, and each and every country has to understand that we are actually in the same pot. And finally, we should obviously never forget, this is also going to you, never forget for whom the EU is meant for. It's for the people. And we haven't gotten to recommendations here, but probably it's important to understand that people who sit here, or those of us who sit here, are going to be considered by many as the elite. We are not from, most of us are not from rural areas. And this is where main problem seems to be lying. So thinking about Europe, spreading the messages, spreading the recommendations should not just stay within, you know, papers and on the internet, but has to go indeed deep to the ground and talking to individuals who are actually then putting vote for or against extremist views that we are all dreadful. Thank you very much to the panelists, Barbara, Nicole, Pavel, and Christian. Sorry for making a mistake with your name, but I know that you are Christian. And thank you for the audience. And if you could give a big round of applause to our panelists. Thank you.